first question I believe is to you, Irene, because you talked a lot about the Kenya Data Protection Act. So, so somebody's asking, James is asking, does Kenya Data Protection Act 2019, is it compliant with GDPR? Can we adopt it as a data protection regulator too? And let's try and make the answer as sweet as possible.
Okay, James, yes, the answer is yes, because the Data Protection Act of 2019 has a lot of similarities to the GDPR. So the answer to your question is yes.
Okay. So the next question is from Norbert Mutinda. What is the prediction when GDPR will be fully applicable in Africa, especially now that most local companies are trading globally? I believe, John, this question is for you.
Yes, thank you very much. Good question. I think the GDPR is largely meant for a European context. You'll see that that legislation has a lot of dissimilarities with the American legislation, because largely most of the data mining, data using companies are American, and so their attitude is to get as much data as is possible into into the hands of American companies. Europe tends to also want to control how data from its jurisdiction goes out and how it can drive more benefit than it does now out of that data. Let's face it, essentially all these legislations are underpinned by economic considerations at the level of governments, at the level of companies. So while American legislation is more of private sector centric, meant to drive, to encourage American companies to get as more data as possible and apply that data for commercial reasons, Europe tends to also want to control data from its jurisdiction for the benefit of Europeans. So much so that the issue is not whether European data legislation will be applicable to Africa. The issue for me is how Africa, out of its economic interests, manages data from within the continent for the development of Africa. And that has been the point of departure, sometimes point of discourse between us and Europe, for that matter.
Okay, John, just hang in there. Yeah. Okay, John, just hang in there. I'm going to give you one half of a question from Irene. So you talked about incentives to boost country uptake of data sharing. Give us some examples of incentives, or what ideas would you have around that?
I said in turn incentives for better data management, so that companies that have better data management would be incentivized at the level of governments, for example. And the most known incentive at the level of governments is tax rebates, tax incentives. And so that has been used especially within the American context to incentivize American companies, for example, to gather as much data as is possible as an incentive for America's economic interest. In our context, if we have companies that are dealing with data, online data for that matter, and we develop a scheme, the regulator, the data commissioner would develop a scheme for proper data management. And essentially there are also international frameworks in regard to such schemes. One of them has just been mentioned in terms of the Commonwealth. So there are also international arrangements that would incentivize companies or organizations that deal with data across borders. But the key one that comes to mind is tax rebates, tax incentives. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. You can mute yourself. Irene, this question is directed at you. Where are we in the local front with regards to the regulations now that DPA was enacted into law in November 2019? That's a question from Kipkemoi Kibet.
Kipkemoi, thanks for your question. I'm afraid I don't think we are in a good place, and I think to some extent the government will say that they have their hands full dealing with COVID-19, but there doesn't seem to be any movement, unless somebody can tell me otherwise, with regards to the advertising of this, the role of the data commissioner by the Public Service Commission. So I really don't know, is the honest answer.
Yeah. Yes, I think the issue is, of course, my colleague speaker is cannot be, answerable to, when is are we likely to see a data commissioner on board? Advertisements have been made in the last couple of weeks by the Public Service Commission, and we do hope that the process is going on. Meanwhile, the issue then is that what happens currently with our data when the commissioner is not in place, almost 7 or so months after the legislation was enacted. So that is the key issue, and I say that the time frame for developing policies and bringing our legislation into force takes too long for this sort of industry, and our governments must increase their pace of turning around stuff like this to ensure that things that are running for a fast-paced industry like this are done much faster. That for me is the issue. Thank you.
All right, John. So don't go away. Hang in there. So there's a question from Awo. To what extent is the Malabo Convention taking into consideration the data of children under 18 years collected on them? 1, online, and 3, 1 and 2, I think the person meant to say online, and then 3, outside the home. So this is around children and the Malabo Convention. And then there's a follow-up question that I'm going to add on to what Awo is saying, and this from Abdelaziz. Is the problem with the data protection in Africa the lack of raising awareness amongst the decision makers in the continent? Okay.
Thank you very much, Laura. Let me start with the last one, if you don't mind. The person who shot the question has answered it effectively. Most of our politicians, and I'm not one, and I have all the due respect for politicians, are essentially in charge of our policy-making process. And they are cut from a world that has traditionally not seen data as something that would be the blood of our lives as opposed to the oil that we know. And so a lot more awareness needs to be raised in order to let our policymakers know that as an economy, socially, morally, we are losing a lot by not having effective data policies and legislation in our country. So yes, public awareness, ensuring that our politicians, whether they'll come on board that fast, is another issue. But we need to ensure that our politicians are brought on board a lot more. Now, turning to the question by Awo from Ghana, I believe, how does the African, the Cyber Convention and data protection legislation deal with what you'd call as minors in Kenya, online and outside the home? Unfortunately, not much of that distinction is made in the convention, and because again you'll find that our countries, in terms of defining who a minor is, do it differently. So it's meant to be a framework that empowers, or rather that informs our governments to pass legislation in terms of how to handle that issue within the context of how their countries perceive or define minors. Essentially, this has to be something a lot more than what the convention would envisage. And I would say that parents, teachers, parents at home, teachers in schools, and that again goes to what the previous questioner raised, public awareness. Parents have a greater responsibility to ensure that whatever children are exposed to is something that is appropriate to them. And that control or that responsibility must be with the parents. It can't be taken to the government or to the local authority or to the African Union. It has to be a parental responsibility. Raising awareness is something that we all need to do at the level of government in terms of policy to ensure that our children are attracted to sites or get to sites that are appropriate. But technology also gives us the opportunity to control what our kids are able to see or watch or engage in online. And so at the level of regulation, we must ensure that technology companies have opt-in, opt-out systems and ways of controlling what the children are able to see or not see. So again, I say this is more of a personal issue. The African Convention gives a framework, doesn't go into details, with the expectation that that will be dealt with in countries, and again, in our homes, in our bedrooms, in our classrooms. Thank you very much.
Okay, moving to the next question, Irene. There's a question here around, and this is from DJ. So DJ is asking, without a data commissioner being appointed, does it continue to be a Wild West scenario, or will enforcement start to take place? If so, where will focus be? And then the second part, another question from DJ that I'd like you to answer as well, directed at you. The data processor, as a data subject, the data processor, who's the Askari, will simply not let me into the building, which is true, DJ. So what to do? And complaining to Safaricom or the CA about unsolicited SMSs, we all know that it's pointless. The big green don't care, and the CA will not slap the hand that feeds them.
Okay, DJ, thanks for your questions. Unfortunately, without a data commissioner, yes, it will continue to be a Wild West scenario, because under the terms of the Data Protection Act, it is the data commissioner who is supposed to enforce the act. So until they're there, until they're in place, no enforcement can happen, which is a sad state of affairs. With regard to getting into buildings, yes, I understand that sometimes you just have to comply in order to get to where you want to go, because if you start telling the Askari about the Data Protection Act, he'll probably shoo you out of the building, and that will be to your detriment, not theirs. So I don't know. I mean, all I can say is play along for now, but hopefully once the data commissioner is in place, then you'll be able to vocalize your rights and maybe to ask them pointed questions. Or perhaps what will be even better is that when you do go to sign in, there will be something on the counter that tells you about exactly how your data is being looked after, collected, stored, etc., etc. We can but live in hope.
Okay. And then moving on to the next question from Kingston Jari. I believe this is for you, John. From your experience, is Kenya, East Africa well positioned to fully implement its DPL with current government structures? If not, high-level pointers, what assistance is needed in form to accelerate implementations, and what would the path be like? So maybe you can just give us a quick overview of how we would be able to implement this if we had to, and are we ready for it?
I think the ready in how government has to be in terms of how our governments are established. Essentially, all the governments in East Africa have ministries or departments that are in charge of ICTs. Unfortunately, again, for example, in Kenya, it's envisaged that the data commissioner would be under the Ministry of ICT. So the issue is that the framework of our governments would provide opportunities for ensuring or for compliance with the Regional Data Convention. The issue for me is in the doing. That you'll find the framework is there, but the data commissioner is there, and I think that is I would need to find this out a bit more. But a couple of our East African countries, still have not put in place what is required by the East African framework, albeit in a number of ways to put it in place. So in terms of government structure, yes, it's there. In terms of application, it's something else, and that really requires political goodwill. I think Rwanda probably is the main exception that I would talk about in the region. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, John. And then I see another question from Imelda. Do we have to consent? And I think this is for you, Irene. Do we have to consent for the Ministry of Health to send us messages, or as government, they are excused out of the law, given the current situation?
Thanks for your question, Imelda. The Ministry of Health can send us messages. Under the Data Protection Act of 2019, there are exceptions. So the Ministry of Health doesn't have to seek our consent to send those messages because they are operating in what is known as vital interests. So they are spreading what you would, or you may look at it differently, useful messages. So they are well within their rights to send us those messages, is the long and short of it.
And then AWO is concerned about this platform that asks for your data, but there is no option to opt out.
Oh, then they are in breach of our Data Protection Act, because they are, under the law, they are required to provide you with an opt-out. So normally, no, this is not. Maybe under their privacy notice, there should be a contact, somebody you can email to ask them about their policy, because although, our law is effective and therefore we should be able to opt out of their marketing messages if we don't want to receive them.
Okay. All right. So I think that concludes our session today. Irene, can I ask you to put your camera on for just 1 second as we close? Thank you so much to our speakers today. You people have been amazing. You've shared such in-depth knowledge. You prepared very well. I always say when you have these webinars, to be able to hold people in a session for more than an hour online is very difficult. Content is king. So on behalf of CIO East Africa and on behalf of the attendees, thank you so much for your excellent preparation and delivery of content. On behalf of CIO, thank you so much to the attendees today. You've been an amazing audience. Thank you for engaging. As I always say, the communication continues online. We will send you the recording as usual. And we hope you can be able to listen in again. If you have any queries, please remember to get in touch with us. Also remember to register for the next session on Thursday. And let's keep talking. Our job is to make sure that we give you all the necessary knowledge and connect you to the experts on different topics so that you're able to effectively work from home and are able to effectively enable your organizations to work from home without any fear. Without much ado, thank you very much and have a fantastic evening. Take care and see you on Thursday. Goodbye.